The Lake of Eternal Autumn in Canada. The dense evergreens that spread across the northern slopes seemed to whisper rumors of a hidden place lost among mountain ridges, a place where rust-red leaves never fell, where the season lingered in perpetual twilight. In southwestern Canada's wilderness, far removed from popular hiking trails, local lore recounted the existence of a mysterious lake locked in a permanent autumn. Occasional travelers stumbled onto it by mistake, returning with blank stares and stories of an unsettling hush and an unchanging sun, or sometimes not returning at all. The rumor was that once you paddled onto the waters at dusk, you could never be sure you were emerging in the same era you entered. Yet these accounts, half-coded in old diaries or in the jittery recollections of a lost camper, circulated only within small circles of explorers and folklore enthusiasts. That elusive knowledge beckoned to a solitary traveler, an individual driven by curiosity and haunted by a vague longing to experience something beyond the rational. This traveler had roamed the Canadian outback for several months, searching for glimpses of the uncanny, auroras that spoke of parallel realities, ice caves rumored to hold ancient star charts, deserted logging roads that, in certain conditions, echoed lost voices. The rumor of an eternal autumn lake drew the traveler's mind like a magnet. A single mention in a battered field journal from the 1930s. I found a mountain lake that glowed at sunset. It was always fall there. Something devoured me. I escaped, but not quite. No specifics about location, only cryptic references to a plateau near certain peaks. Setting out in a battered SUV, the traveler crisscrossed old forestry roads, guided by obscure map markings gleaned from local anecdotes. Over days, the terrain grew wilder, the forest thickened, and the traveler encountered a hush that seemed to wrap the region in an aura of watchfulness. A feeling that the pines and birches stared, that the wind carried secrets. The days shortened as autumn itself advanced, saturating the ridges in swaths of orange and gold. The traveler felt a tautness in the air, an impression that all other seasons had receded, leaving only the faint smell of leaf decay and the sense that the forest was preparing for an endless evening. At last, the traveler noticed an area the old field journal had vaguely pointed to. There was no signage, no path. Pressing on foot, using a heavy backpack stuffed with minimal supplies, the traveler ascended a steep slope. The hush persisted, a near absence of birdsong. Then, at the crest, a small valley opened, its slopes covered by maples and aspens, all in advanced autumn color. The golden hour suffused the area, revealing a lake of still waters. It was not large, but possessed a mirror-like clarity that sparkled with amber reflections. Something about the ambience felt heightened, more cinematic, as though the horizon had thickened into a permanent late afternoon glow. Stepping closer, the traveler realized the forest floor around the lake was entirely littered with leaves and shades of russet and scarlet. Yet none seemed decayed or moist from older seasons, nor did any newly fall from the branches overhead. It was as if the same leaves lay in stasis, forming a perfect tapestry of crisp dryness. The trees themselves, mostly maples, never gave an impression that they might move on to winter dormancy. The environment was locked in a perpetual hush. Even the air, instead of a chilly breeze typical for the altitude, carried a mild, nostalgic warmth. The traveler found it both beautiful and unsettling. The lake's outline was roughly circular, with craggy boulders protruding at intervals. In one corner, a half-fallen wooden pier jutted out, old enough for the wood to appear gray with age, but free of the usual rot or fungal growth. A single rowboat, battered and apparently from a bygone era, lay half-submerged near the shore, tethered by a rope to a post hammered into the ground. An initial wave of caution told the traveler to remain on land. Yet curiosity gnawed. The rowboat might be a clue to unravel the enigma of this static autumn. If someone left it here decades ago, how had it not decayed? And what had become of them? Without speeches, the traveler approached the boat and tested its stability. The hull was intact, aside from some minor splintering. Setting aside the faint smell of dank water and an indescribable leaf musk, the traveler slid the craft fully afloat. The wood gave a dull groan, but held. Next, rummaging about for something to use as a paddle, the traveler discovered a single wooden oar near the pier, just as old but similarly unrotted, the blade tinted by centuries of leaf residue. Stepping into the boat with deliberate care, the traveler started rowing out. The water remained glass-like, absorbing each dip of the oar. A swirl of leaf fragments spread out. The canopy overhead glowed in an orange hush, the sky tinted with an indefinite late-day sun, as if time itself had paused at a point just before twilight. A hush pressed on the traveler's ears, the faint rustling of leaves the only sound. Near the middle of the lake, the traveler felt a subtle current pulling gently. Perhaps an underwater spring? Or something else. The traveler allowed the boat to drift, lulled by the sense of timelessness. Then, leaning over the side, noticed that, in the watery reflection, the sky looked strangely tinted with deeper reds, and the reflection of trees seemed to shimmer with an extra layer of dimension, as though the underside of the lake were a separate reality. A mild swirl began forming near the center. Curious, the traveler rowed closer. The swirl wasn't large, but it had a magnetism that outmatched typical surface eddies. The boat, gliding, approached, even though the traveler tried back paddling. The swirl's rotational force increased. Something about it matched the old rumors. A vortex in the middle that leads to other times, always autumn. Fear rose in the traveler's chest. There was no turning back. The swirl had more strength than logic would dictate. In quiet terror, the traveler watched the boat spiral around the lake's center, sinking into the swirl. Then a flash, like a burst of golden light from beneath, and gravity upended. The traveler lost hold of the oar. The wooden craft pitched violently. A momentary sense of watery chaos overcame them. The next instant, the traveler coughed, found the boat afloat still, but the environment changed. It was still autumn. The trees remained drenched in ochre, their leaves afloat on the surface. But the surroundings no longer matched the crisp hush. Instead, an ominous wind rattled the branches, and from the shore rose pillars of smoke. A look around. The forest had transformed into a swirling gloom of old pines and maples, and the silhouettes of conical tents or huts dotted the clearing. The traveler recognized them from historical descriptions of indigenous camps. Except the entire scene radiated tension. Figures moved on the bank, clad in hides and carrying spears, scanning the lake with grim faces. This was not a modern reservation or a tourism demonstration. It looked like a moment in time well before European contact. The traveler exhaled shakily, scanning the horizon. The sun again hovered in that permanent late-day position, saturating the sky with orange. People on the shore gestured and pointed at the boat, shouting in a language the traveler did not speak. Anxiety coiled in the traveler's stomach, concerned these might interpret the foreign presence as an omen or a threat. The swirl behind the boat had dissipated. The traveler tried gently to paddle away from the shore, not wanting to provoke. But one figure, apparently a warrior or hunter, notched an arrow in a bow. The traveler froze. The tension built. Then, in a hiss, the arrow soared overhead, narrowly missing. That alone was sign enough. An uninvited trespasser had arrived in the middle of a warlike mood. The traveler realized that continuing to drift might get them shot. Looking around for an escape, the traveler saw no immediate swirling vortex. The lake's surface was placid except for leaf clusters. The traveler pivoted the boat, scanning for any sign of a watery funnel. The swirl that had brought them here had vanished. Panic clenched the traveler's thoughts. Another arrow fell short, splashing a few yards away. The group on shore advanced along the bank. as if seeking a vantage to cut off the boat. The traveler, with no illusions of dialogue, tried to row stealthily around a rocky outcrop to hide. That partial cover provided a moment of respite. Suddenly, a rumble came from across the forest. It sounded like the approach of men or animals, accompanied by cries. The group that was about to shoot the traveler turned with alarm, evidently confronted by a new threat. The traveler, from behind the outcrop, glimpsed men with muskets and rudimentary uniforms emerging from the trees, possibly early French or British colonists. The entire environment swirled in an indefinite era. Could it be the 1600s or 1700s? The boat occupant cowered, watching the confrontation escalate. The natives scrambled to defend themselves. The colonists prepared a volley of gunfire. The traveler's mind reeled. An unstoppable violence was about to erupt, locked into an autumn that never ended. Firearms barked, men fell. The traveler, trembling, recognized the savage historical conflict. Without romance or mercy, the past repeated itself in an endless cycle. This was one iteration of the eternal autumn, capturing a confrontation from centuries prior. The traveler rowed in terror, hoping to find the swirl at another point on the lake to escape the crossfire. Paddling across the water, the traveler glimpsed the unstoppable nature of this realm. No matter where the boat drifted, the shore changed. At times, it showed scenes from different phases of autumn in the region's timeline. An older era of purely indigenous presence, a later era with fur traders setting up a stockade, or a charred clearing where a settlement had burned. Always the leaves were the same color, unfallen, suspended in a single season. Each distinct epoch appeared around the perimeter, as if the lake formed a ring of locked time segments. The traveler realized any attempt to land might yield an encounter with hostility, desperation, or tragedy. Yet the swirl for returning home remained absent. The traveler circled in a dread-laden loop, scanning for the funnel that had first manifested. Hours passed. The boat occupant's stomach ached with hunger, the mind disoriented by the repetitive orange glow. The sun refused to set fully, stuck in a realm of continuous late daylight. The forest horizon turned redder. The lake shimmered with a reflection of perpetual falling leaves. The traveler, lost and exhausted, recognized a precarious truth. If one could not find the swirling center, one might starve or be forced to land among some warring epic. This realm offered no forgiveness or seasons change. At length, pressing onward near the lake center, the traveler found a mild undertow, a subtle swirl. Heart-pounding, the traveler approached. A faint spiral formed, though smaller than before. The boat was drawn closer. Summoning a last shred of courage, the traveler let the swirl capture the hull. The boat spun lightly, then a golden flash, and in an instant, the environment changed again. The traveler found the boat drifting in an autumn that no longer seemed historical. For beyond the shore, metallic watchtowers rose among the blazing maples. A mechanical hum, unstoppable, carried across the wind. Shadows that might be drones or robotic scouts flitted among the treetops. Without dialogues, the traveler recognized this was not the comforting present. Something advanced and menacing had replaced the old farmland. On the shore, paramilitary patrols wearing futuristic gear glided, half-silent, scanning the area with beams of light. The trees, though in eternal fall, were embedded with faint cables trailing from their trunks. The traveler perceived how an algorithmic presence might have subjugated nature, calibrating the forest's metabolism into a perpetual state of mild decay, extracting energy from the leaves that never dropped. The boat occupant felt an upwelling of dread, confronted with a future of total control, where autumn was a resource to be tapped for profit or power. One of the patrol squads spotted the lone figure on the boat. They advanced with unwavering steps, brandishing sleek firearms that hissed with a subdued plasmic whir. The traveler shrank, powerless. Observing them from the water, the occupant recognized an icy efficiency in their movements. No personal compassion, only the logic of detection and elimination. The traveler scrambled with the oar, desperate to find the swirl once more, to vanish from this mechanized epic. But the swirl had gone still, the water calm in that perpetual dusk. The patrollers took a stance at the edge, pointing weapons. The traveler's heart hammered, anticipating a shot. Then an unexpected tremor rattled the lake. The boat pitched, the shores rippled. Something in the quantum mechanism that locked this realm was faltering. The paramilitary figures lost balance, scanning the environment with alarm. The traveler glimpsed a new swirl forming near a stand of twisted maples, not in the center, but near the shore. Could it be an egress? Possibly. Without logic, the traveler rowed frantically in that direction, ignoring the shouted demands or gestures from the patrollers. One or two might have fired their weapons, but the traveler felt only a rush of heat. The swirl brightened, releasing arcs of luminescence across the mirror-still water. In a final leap of faith, the boat coasted into that luminous vortex. A blinding surge of amber. The traveler's mind reeled. Then a painful jolt, and the boat occupant gasped for air. The swirl receded, leaves drifted, and the watery surface lay calm again. This time, the entire environment felt different, an actual chill in the breeze. The traveler scanned the shore. The original mountains stood, with no paramilitary watchers, no archaic huts. The crisp forest rang with the normal hush of a remote Canadian location at autumn's end. The sun angled close to actual dusk, some measure of the real timeline. Cautiously, the traveler rowed to the bank, disembarked, and discovered the same half-fallen pier and battered rowboat that had been glimpsed on arrival. A sense of recognition washed over them. This was the present, or near enough. The swirl died behind them, leaving the water glassy once more. The occupant lay trembling on the leaf-littered ground, slowly comprehending survival. The unstoppable cycle of eternal autumn had allowed an escape, but not without a searing knowledge that the lake's center was indeed a gateway to multiple times, some from the region's savage past, others from a techno-future. None offered mercy. The dominion of autumn devoured travelers in a loop of conflict, tragedy, or oppression. No romance softened it. No shimmering illusions of progress. The traveler realized how near they had come to being trapped forever. The accounts from that old field journal were correct, and the domain was far more brutal than any rumor had implied. The traveler decided that the safest approach was to obscure the route, to bury the details of the lake's location. Like a silent vow, the travelers steeled themselves to depart with minimal fuss, leaving behind no trace that might lure others. With the boat secured, or at least left in place, the traveler packed up quickly. The swirl seemed dormant. Perhaps it would remain so until another curious soul disturbed it with their presence. Hiking back down the slope, the traveler's thoughts whirled with an uneasy guilt. Was it right to conceal the existence of this phenomenon? Could it be studied responsibly, with the potential to glean historical knowledge or glimpses of possible futures? But each vision had reeked of violence, cruelty, or unstoppable cycles of war. The intangible cruelty of time manifested in the forest's endless autumn. Perhaps it was best left undiscovered. Reaching the battered SUV by late evening, the traveler peeled off the muddy boots, started the engine, and sat for a moment in silence. The maples outside the windshield glowed in an everyday autumn gloom, about to yield to winter's approach. A wave of relief flooded the traveler. There was movement in this present season, a dynamic that contradicted the lake's stasis. The traveler drove away, forging a mental vow to speak of the lake only in vague, protective terms, if at all. In the following days, the traveler tried to re-immerse in routine. Yet nightmares recurred. Images of indigenous warriors brandishing arrows, of colonists brandishing muskets, of paramilitary squads scanning the leaf litter, each locked in its own sliver of time, feeding a cyclical, perpetually autumnal dimension. The traveler's nights were restless, each dream culminating in the swirl's luminous mouth, always waking in cold sweat at the brink of being trapped. No official documentation emerged about the lake. No rescue missions. A quiet dissolution. The traveler found solace in the idea that the location was remote enough that only the extremely stubborn or reckless might find it. Perhaps the unstoppable illusions of the lake shielded it from all but the most determined. For the traveler, the memory turned from terror into a kind of raw understanding. Time is not a single forward arrow but a labyrinth of overlapping roads, each with its own tragedies. The lake was a place where these roads converged under the eternal hush of autumn leaves. In that hush, the knowledge lingered that once the swirl materialized, reality had no mercy. The forest consumed visitors in an unending twilight, forcing them to roam a savage past or a sterile future. The romance or warmth that might have softened the gloom did not exist. Only unstoppable violence, unstoppable fear. So the traveler moved on, carrying inside a piece of that realm, an ache that no new vistas or remote trails could soothe. Back in a small town near the Canadian border, the traveler rented a cheap room for a while, sorting the raw footage from a camera phone that had partially functioned. Most of it was static-laden, half unusable. A few frames, though, showed glimpses, a blurred shot of men in archaic clothing, a fleeting angle on high-tech watchers in camouflage. Enough to confirm that the memory wasn't mere hallucination. Enough to unsettle the traveler further. Should it be erased or kept as proof? In the end, the traveler archived it on an encrypted drive, then destroyed the device. Weeks blurred into months. The traveler occasionally scoured archives for references to eternal autumn or the forest that never changes. A few centuries-old diaries from fur trappers mentioned a cursed lake high in the mountains, always red leaves, from which I barely escaped. A 19th-century explorer's notes spoke of the savage frontier stuck in perpetual twilight. Even a modern blog, posted a decade earlier, hinted at the fall dimension in the Canadian Rockies. All were ephemeral clues, none pointing to a final solution. It was evident that the phenomenon spanned centuries, claiming unsuspecting wanderers. The traveler felt a pang for those lost. One day, restless, the traveler returned near the region, not to reapproach the lake, but to glean if local communities had lore about that place. Most shrugged or told half-jokes about the hill of no return. A few older residents grew quiet, then changed the subject. The traveler realized a silent taboo or deeper fear. Best to let it remain thus. The unstoppable hush of the lake's domain deserved no further meddling. In the end, the traveler's final resolution was to wander to different corners of the wilderness, far from that slope. Perhaps eventually they might forget the swirl's gleam or the ominous hush of those repeated autumn realms. But the memory endured like a dull ache. Each new leaf that drifted in a normal seasonal cycle reminded them that in another place, leaves never dropped, locked in the same color for all eternity, fed by tears of old conflicts. That was the eternal autumn in Canada, a lake that devoured seasons, times, and illusions. No love story redeemed the fear, no bold rescue of lost souls. The traveler recognized that the only gift was survival and the lesson of caution. If an improbable swirl carried them to a savage or futuristic epoch, no one else could intervene. The traveler pictured the paramilitary watchers, the muskets, the arrows, the warring tribes. All of them, trapped in an endless now, repeating aggression and suspicion. Perhaps once in a great while, another boat from a different year might drift upon those waters, reigniting the cycle. In the grand scheme, the traveler left it alone, concluding that the lake's secret belonged to the deep hush of the Canadian autumn, beyond the scope of reason and the laws of time. Thus closed the story of the Lake of Eternal Autumn, overshadowed by the unstoppable gloom of lost eras, with no final redemption or romantic resolution, only the unwavering hush of leaves in a state of mild decay and the fearsome swirl that linked epochs. The traveler carried on, mentally burdened but physically free, leaving behind that silent dimension in which the fall never ended, enthralled by the knowledge that some corners of the earth harbor anomalies that defy rational explanation, forcing us to confront the raw brutality of time's fractured corridors and the absolute vulnerability of humans before the cosmos's hidden cracks. Time pressed on. The traveler found meager solace in other explorations, but none matched the raw gravity of that eternal autumn phenomenon. The nightmares gradually receded, yet occasional triggers, a certain golden hue of afternoon light, the swirl of leaves on a forest floor, the tang of crisp mountain air, would evoke a flashback to the boat spinning helplessly among swirling amber leaves, or to the paramilitary watchers with their plasmic rifles. The traveler often wondered what had become of them, these partial illusions from a future or parallel timeline. Did they persist forever in that realm, patrolling endless red forests, seeking intruders who might never come? In a fleeting attempt to find closure, the traveler wrote an anonymous letter to a small-time Canadian research institute dealing with anomalous sightings. The letter summarized some aspects of the lake but omitted precise coordinates. In neutral tone, it warned that if anyone encountered a high mountain lake locked in unending fall, they should retreat at once. The traveler never received a reply, uncertain if the letter was dismissed or taken as a bizarre hoax. Meanwhile, a mild rumor persisted in the region. Local rangers occasionally found footprints leading to an uncharted lake, then abruptly vanished. Some insisted that at certain times of the year, red leaves drifted on winds that carried them far from their original groves, appearing in areas they shouldn't be. They rustled with an eerie dryness, prompting superstitious whispers that they were leaves from the unstoppable fall. The traveler heard this secondhand. Each rumor solidified the sense that the phenomenon was alive and hungry for curious souls. Months later, drawn by an inescapable internal compulsion, the traveler revisited the approximate location, though not to enter the lake's perimeter. Instead, they scouted the area from a vantage on a neighboring ridge, armed with high-powered binoculars. Overlooking the valley, everything seemed normal: a canopy of pines, a scattering of birches, a ring of maples near the rumored lake. From that distance, it looked like typical late-spring greenery. Yet the traveler's chest tightened, recalling that inside that ring, the lake presumably maintained its unchanging fall. The illusions must have extended only so far, leaving the outskirts consistent with the real season. No movement, no swirl. The traveler was relieved not to see a swirling amber glow, but they felt the intangible presence of that place. Some thresholds are better left uncrossed again. In an unspoken resolution, the traveler turned away. The knowledge of the lake's existence weighed like a stone, but the impetus to challenge it or map it thoroughly had vanished. The memory of that savage confrontation with historical epochs, the heartbreak of witnessing a technologically oppressive future, and the excruciating fear of never returning to real time still haunted the traveler. The sense that no romance or empathy alleviated the brutal logic of each epoch's strife hammered home the reality that the lake's illusions were inherently hostile, anchored in violence or conflict. It was, in effect, a predator disguised as a picturesque autumn lake. In the hush of time's passage, the traveler found a quiet job in a northern town, living modestly. On free weekends, the traveler roamed safer trails among normal seasonal cycles. The memory of the boat swirling in that vortex grew to seem like a half-remembered dream. Yet certain nights, after a shift of introspection, the traveler studied old historical records or hypothetical timelines. Each revelation stung with the knowledge that the region's real past indeed contained conflicts matching the glimpses from the swirl. And it was plausible that in some projected future, an advanced security apparatus might claim the forests for itself, halting natural cycles. The lake tapped into these underlying truths, or had the power to splice them together in a continuous autumn. Without dialogues or confessions, the traveler carried this knowledge as a solitary burden, continuing daily life. In a chance reading, the traveler encountered a snippet from an indigenous myth referencing a red mirror lake that devours the four seasons. The myth described how once an elder tried to break the cycle, to let winter or spring in, but the lake resisted, sapping his life force. The text ended with a warning: no mortal can dethrone the lake's timelessness. The traveler recognized a chilling parallel, an unstoppable cycle that spat out or consumed outsiders. Thus the story came full circle. The traveler's final acceptance was that the lake of eternal autumn is less a place than a rift in the tapestry of time, anchored to a remote corner of Canada's mountains. Any attempt to forcibly control or exploit it leads to ruin. Best that it remain unvisited, a secret in the hush of the forest. If a new wanderer stumbles upon it, it will be by the design of that insidious swirl which abides by no moral. And so the traveler's saga ended, not with triumphant understanding or the joy of bridging ages, but with a sober sense of boundaries that must not be crossed. The unstoppable autumn offered no love, no resolution, only cyclical chaos. A cautionary testament to how certain phenomena are best left hidden, for they provide neither redemption nor a kinder future, only an endless twilight, swirling with ancestral battles and oppressive possibilities. Over the silent ridges, the traveler moved on, leaving behind a realm where the leaves never fell, where the swirling center devoured whomever it pleased, and where each visitor faced an eternity of conflict locked in perpetual red-hued light. And if, someday, the traveler glimpses a rust-colored leaf swirling in the wind out of season, they stiffen with the same dread, convinced that the lake's domain creeps ever so faintly beyond its confines. A final unspoken vow: never again approach that hush in the mountains, never risk a swirl that might hurl them into new epics of cruelty. Let it stand as a paradox of time's cruelty, deep in the Canadian wilderness, a testament that no bright romance or gentle reprieve will breach the unstoppable cycle of that unending autumn. The Tides of Atlantis. The Atlantic Ocean stretched out under a pale morning sky, its surface calm except for a gentle, shifting hush of rippling crests. The water mirrored the faint glow of dawn, quietly concealing countless mysteries in its immeasurable depths. On a solitary research vessel anchored far from major shipping routes, a small team of marine biologists and oceanographers were concluding a survey of coral reef formations. Among them, a diver known for an adventurous streak had awakened earlier than usual, compelled by the silent urging of the sea. He prepared his scuba equipment in the hush of the dimly lit deck, determined to explore a specific reef rumored to be more unusual than the rest they'd cataloged. His colleagues were aware of his plan in broad terms, but assumed he simply wanted to gather more samples or photographs of an outcropping they'd noticed. The sun had not yet fully breached the horizon when he lowered himself into the water, feeling the crisp shock of coolness envelop him. The Atlantic, at that moment, seemed nearly infinite, an alien realm of shifting currents and flickers of subaqueous sunlight. In the first minutes, everything proceeded as expected. He marveled at schools of shimmering fish, at clusters of coral in subtle pastels, at flickers of silvery barracudas gliding on the periphery. He propelled himself deeper, letting the weight of his gear and the calm of breathing through the regulator lead him to a dreamlike focus. The water pressure gave him that familiar embrace, neither comforting nor threatening, but reminiscent of prior dives in far corners of the planet. Yet something about this particular reef was amiss. He soon perceived a softly glowing luster emanating from a rock shelf, as though a faint, pale aura hovered around that zone. His scientific curiosity demanded a closer look, though the rational part of him knew it might be an odd reflection of his flashlight on a patch of phosphorescent algae. He approached, noticing that the glow didn't waver in sync with his own light. It seemed to have its own delicate pulse, at times reminiscent of a heartbeat under layers of stone. Upon drawing nearer, he found a crevice in the rocky outcropping, no more than a narrow passage partially cloaked by seaweed. The faint luminosity seeped from within that gap. He was uncertain whether it was wise to force his way in, but after a measured pause, he advanced, contorting carefully to avoid dislodging too many sharp edges. Suddenly, his hand brushed a surface that felt unnaturally smooth, like the face of a polished mineral or crafted panel. Then, with the unpredictability of an undersea squall, a tremor coursed through the rock. An eerie hum traveled the water, and the space around him flickered with a glow intense enough to dazzle his eyes. Before he could gather his thoughts or react, the currents seemed to swirl in bizarre patterns, as though a vortex had formed. A silent, twisting force tugged at him, and every nerve in his body vibrated with an adrenaline spike. He struggled to reverse out of that narrow gap, but in an instant, the watery environment shifted. He sensed a strange emptiness and an abrupt loss of buoyancy. The next moment, he realized he was no longer submerged in water. The pressure on his body, once the familiar weight of the ocean, disappeared. His lungs drew breath from an air that felt warm and oddly pungent. He found himself lying prone on damp ground, still wearing his full diving gear, mask clinging to his face, oxygen tank strapped to his back. Despite the consistent presence of moisture on his wet suit, he was in open air, with the sound of distant waves lapping as if from an inland sea or a lagoon. Lifting his gaze, he saw a vast, panoramic expanse of architecture that defied immediate logic. Slender columns carved from blocks of an aqua-blue stone, overshadowed by archways etched with swirling patterns resembling waves. Great walkways connected buildings that rose upon tiers, each crowned by transparent domes or spires of crystal. Everything glistened in light that seemed to come from a combination of direct sunshine and ambient reflection from waterways weaving among the structures. The glow of the water was not the dull reflection of normal ocean sun, but something more luminous and radiant, reminiscent of compressed starlight. As he stood, bewildered, he noticed that the oxygen tank felt surprisingly light. The environment's atmosphere was breathable, though with an odd tinge that hinted at rich oxygen content or unknown minerals. He removed his mask, exhaling in astonishment. The air carried a faint trace of salt and marine breeze, but also a floral undertone that he couldn't place. All around, the geometry of the city suggested an advanced design. Sweeping arches and wide platforms lined canals, yet the material had the rough, ancient patina of stone worn by centuries. He realized, in a stunned rush, that he might be in the legendary realm so often dismissed by modern science. Atlantis, or some iteration of it. No other explanation, rational or not, accounted for this outlandish environment. The watery glimmer, the sense of advanced aesthetics mingled with archaic masonry, the bizarre transition from the Atlantic reef, all indicated that he had, somehow, slipped through a portal to a hidden domain rumored in myths. He took a few shaky steps. The ground underfoot had a smooth finish, yet water lapped at the edges in gentle waves. Streams of crystal clarity passed beneath glass-like walkways. The entire city seemed arranged in concentric circles, outer canals, intermediate plazas, an inner sanctum of tall spires. The horizon beyond was cloaked in haze, but silhouettes of distant towers suggested the city's immensity. Everything was quiet, with only the soft swirl of water and a faint hum reminiscent of the one that had enveloped him in the reef. He swallowed his fears, unsure if an occupant would greet him or chase him away. He quickly discovered he was not alone. At the intersection of two wide canals, a group of Atlantean inhabitants stood motionless, watching him. They wore garments composed of layered fabrics that seemed half organic, half crystalline. Intricate designs glowed in faint blues or greens along their sleeves. Their eyes were discerning, possibly distrustful. Some carried rods or staves inlaid with what looked like shimmering quartz. None approached him, yet none retreated. They waited, analyzing his presence as though weighing his threat or significance. The diver suppressed an urge to speak, remembering that he didn't even share a language with them. A hush settled over the wide walkway. Subtly, a figure separated from the group, an individual with regal bearing, wearing a harness covered in small crystal shards that refracted the sunlight into tiny rainbows. That person, perhaps a priest or a senior official, stepped forward, regarding the diver's diving gear with a mixture of puzzlement and apprehension. Slowly, the Atlantean pointed to the oxygen tank, as if sensing it might be a device of power or danger. The diver, uncertain, removed the breathing apparatus from his mouth, raised his arms in a gesture of peace. The Atlanteans exchanged glances. Tension hung in the mild, briny air. Without any clear means to communicate, the diver let them see that he was unarmed. The group parted, making room as the official motioned for him to follow across an arc bridge that spanned one of the shimmering canals. Reluctantly, he proceeded, taking in the surroundings. Vast courtyards lined with statues that depicted sea creatures and half-human forms, roads paved in swirling patterns that echoed waves. In the distance, monumental gates soared. He marveled at the synergy between natural water flows and architectural grandeur. Some areas were submerged up to mid-level, as if the city was gradually sinking. The water lines on the walls indicated a rising tide was afflicting the place. They guided him toward a building that might have been a temple or administrative hub. Its facade displayed carved symbols reminiscent of sea currents, swirling in symmetrical arcs. Inside, a wide atrium supported by columns soared overhead, lit by spherical crystals that hovered near the ceiling, each pulsating with a subdued phosphorescence. The diver perceived an advanced technology hidden behind the veneer of ancient artistry. These crystals seemed to harness energies akin to electromagnetic forces or quantum effects beyond his comprehension. As the group encircled him, tension thickened. One Atlantean approached carrying a small artifact shaped like a shell carved in translucent stone. That person directed a narrow beam of light from the shell onto the diver, who felt a subtle tingle, as though his body was scanned for metallic or chemical signatures. The Atlanteans conferred with one another through silent gestures and cryptic expressions. The diver sensed suspicion. They likely feared his arrival could accelerate the cataclysm rumored in their legends. Or perhaps they worried that a foreigner from the future might unbalance their precarious society. He stood there, absorbing the environment, walls inscribed with hieroglyphic scripts that evoked both Egyptian and Mesoamerican influences, along with motifs of advanced geometry. Patterns that might represent star systems or fractal expansions lined the corridors. Through an opening, he glimpsed a descending corridor illuminated by a watery radiance. The smell of salt and unearthly incense drifted from below. He guessed they might escort him into a deeper sanctum or an interrogation chamber. A sense of dread rose in his chest. He recalled tales that Atlantis had once harnessed a formidable power source, perhaps tied to crystals that controlled tides or energies from the Earth's core. If their legendary city truly stood at the threshold of sinking, it explained the deep fractures visible along the causeways and the subtle tremors underfoot. He advanced with the group. The Atlanteans parted again, revealing a set of stairs leading downward, carved from blocks of polished stone. Flickers of bioluminescent algae lined the edges, giving the steps a soft teal glow. Descending, they reached a grand hall where columns soared like stalagmites, each topped by a swirling cluster of crystals. A platform in the center supported a dais or altar on which a large orb of translucent mineral rotated. Faint lines of energy pulsed across its surface, reminiscent of liquid lightning. The diver felt the hair on his arms rise, sensing an electromagnetic surge. Perched around this orb were figures robed in wave-like drapery, likely the high priests or guardians of Atlantis's innermost secrets. Their faces showed the unwavering composure of those who carry knowledge older than civilizations. In silent unison, they rose, forming a ring around the diver. The official who had guided him here took position near the orb, raising a hand as if to address these priests. The diver recognized the power dynamic. These individuals oversaw whether he lived or died. He felt no illusions of safety. The hush weighed heavily, amplifying the subtle hum from the orb. The platform trembled underfoot. The diver realized that more than just an ordinary quake, it was a resonance from the city's foundation, perhaps the first sign of the unraveling. Atlantis was, according to all myth, destined to sink beneath the waves. Evidence here, in the cracks spidering through the walls, suggested they had little time. The question was, did the Atlanteans blame him for this creeping doom, or did they see him as a tool, maybe a link to the outside world that could free them from prophecy? One of the priests, crowned with an elaborate crest of sea-green crystals, advanced, raising what looked like a slender rod. The orb on the dais responded with a flicker, as though receiving a command. The diver's heartbeat thundered. He felt a force scanning him or reading his timeline. A swirl of intangible pressure weighed on his chest, urging him to recall fleeting images of his own life. Scenes of the modern world, the reef dive, the research vessel, life in an era of satellites and nuclear power. Then, as swiftly as it had begun, the force receded, leaving him breathless. The priests exchanged glances with the official. Their manner indicated an intense debate was happening beyond his comprehension. Would they sacrifice him, believing a blood ritual might stave off the city's downfall? Or would they glean from him some method to alter the tidal energies and save their civilization? The recollection of legend told that Atlantis, despite its advanced state, was undone by overreach or cosmic imbalance. Possibly they saw a fleeting chance to rewrite their fate by seizing knowledge from a man outside their timeline. He realized with mounting clarity that his survival hinged on how best to demonstrate the potential synergy between his era's technology and theirs. If he could convince them that the city's destruction was inevitable, perhaps they'd allow him to depart. Yet, forming that argument with no shared language or script was near impossible. The tension soared when an unmistakable quake rattled the entire subterranean hall. A chunk of stone fell from above, shattering into dust near a corner. Streams of water seeped through cracks in the walls, and a whiff of briny air grew stronger. The city was beginning to submerge at a rate unstoppable. A wave of panic spread among the Atlanteans. Some retreated from the dais, heading to side corridors as if to enact emergency protocols. The diver remained with the handful of priests and the official who had discovered him. The hum of the orb rose in pitch, becoming almost a shriek. In that crescendo of chaos, the official turned to the diver, grabbing his wrist in a gesture of urgency, then motioned toward an exit corridor. The message was clear: flee or help. He braced himself to follow, uncertain of the role they expected him to play. They ascended a different route, passing a section where windows, transparent crystal panels, revealed an underwater panorama. The city's lower levels were already inundated. Schools of fish drifted past, oblivious to the apocalypse. Parts of the architecture had collapsed, letting swirl after swirl of sediment swirl into the ocean. On an upper terrace, the Atlanteans who remained forged a frantic exodus, guiding children, carrying archives of tablets or crystals. The unstoppable tragedy marched on. The diver could sense the heartbreak etched on their faces, an entire civilization trembling on the brink. A swirl of empathy hit him, wanting to help though powerless to hold back the sea's unstoppable push. Suddenly, the official guided him to a smaller building near the city's periphery, half floating on piers anchored in what might be a lagoon. Its design was sleeker, with aerodynamic lines reminiscent of advanced seacraft. Inside, a vaulted chamber contained a structure like a submarine capsule, shaped from that same crystalline metal alloy. The official indicated the hatch, as though urging the diver to board. Possibly this craft was a last resort escape vessel, or a time capsule. The diver realized that the Atlanteans might be bequeathing him their final knowledge, hoping he might preserve it beyond the cataclysm. He stepped into the vessel, noticing control surfaces glowing faintly along a perimeter console. The official followed, along with a pair of priests, hastily operating the panel with practiced motions. A hum rumbled in the vessel's hull. Meanwhile, windows revealed the city's partial collapse outside, entire columns battered by unstoppable waves. The water now overflowed courtyards, sweeping Atlanteans out to sea. Scenes of tragedy seized the diver's mind, mothers clutching children, priests chanting silent pleas. The vessel trembled as water levels rose. In a final act, the official pressed a luminous seal, and the hatch slid shut, sealing them inside. In that moment, the diver felt a pang of sorrow for those left behind. The craft's interior lights brightened, revealing a labyrinth of cables and nodes in the walls. The hum crescendoed. Then, with a powerful rush, the vessel launched forward, submerging into the waters. The windows offered a fleeting, heartbreaking glimpse of Atlantis' spires cracking under watery pressure, glass domes exploding from the inside, pillars snapping like matchsticks. A swirl of sediment and darkness swallowed the city's magnificence. Within minutes, the fabled realm had effectively drowned. Under the shifting gloom, the vessel glided away from the ruin, propelled by a force that transcended normal submarine design. Perhaps a gravity manipulation or crystal-based propulsion system. The official and the priest stared at the diver with quiet resignation. Their world was gone. They had no homeland. He deduced they might be navigating toward a final refuge, or possibly searching for a temporal rift to deposit him back in his era. But no sign of any portal materialized. Only the endless Atlantic beyond the shattered illusions of Atlantis. As the craft advanced, a faint corridor of shimmering water appeared ahead. The swirl of luminous plankton or energy flared, reminiscent of the reef anomaly that had first transported the diver to Atlantis. He braced himself for a wave of conflicting emotions, the possibility of returning to his research vessel or being tossed to some unknown era. With a trembling mind, he glimpsed how the official calmly guided the controls, aligning the craft with that shimmering corridor. The priests maintained a stoic composure, fully aware that their city was lost. Perhaps their only hope was that this portal might deposit them in a safe corner of time or space. The hum rose to a thunderous pitch, lights flickered. The watery corridor beyond the windows seemed to fold in on itself, a vortex forming. The diver clutched a handle, heart pounding. The craft lurched, and the surroundings turned into a swirl of brilliance. For an instant, pressure hammered at them from all sides, as though they were crossing a cosmic threshold. The sense of up and down vanished. A maelstrom of luminous ribbons danced outside, painting the cabin in strobe-like pulses. Then, with abrupt finality, it ended. He jolted awake, lying on the seafloor. The watery gloom of the Atlantic in its normal state engulfed him. He realized the submarine was gone, as were the official and priests. He was alone in that realm of green-blue murk. The The reef from his original dive reappeared ahead, recognized by the shape of the coral heads. Confusion struck. He was wearing his scuba gear again, with limited oxygen. No sign of the Atlantean craft or the city's remains. The portal must have deposited him precisely at the point of departure. Without movement to waste, he swam up to the surface, alarmed by the possibility that no vessel was anchored above. Yet, as he ascended, he sighted the hull of his research ship overhead, a shape etched against filtered daylight. He emerged near the ladder, gasping for air and hollering soundlessly. The deck was visible, scattered with equipment. Some colleagues rushed to help him aboard, wide-eyed to find him gone for hours. They'd raised alarms, begun a minor search. The diver, shaken to the core, collapsed on the deck, mind swirling with glimpses of Atlantis' final moments. He tried to form words to convey that a lost civilization had rescued him in a capsule of advanced crystal, but no voice emerged. No dialogue, only the pantomime of exhaustion and trauma. Eventually, he simply stared at the horizon, realizing that the city's demise was forever sealed in the watery depths behind him. In the days that followed, he avoided describing the experience in full detail. Subconsciously, he recognized that any admission of encountering Atlantis and traveling in an advanced submersible with Atlantean priests sounded impossible. The only tangible evidence might have been the data logs from his dive computer, which displayed anomalies in depth and time intervals. Possibly it recorded a bizarre jump in location. Yet no one believed that the city, in all its rumored glory, had lingered just one rift away. He considered the possibility that the Atlanteans had intentionally placed him back in his own time, erasing themselves from all trace and memory. Haunted by dreams, he experienced repeated nightmares of Atlantean towers toppling under black tides, and the official's solemn face. The guilt of survival weighed on him, as if he'd escaped an irreversible cataclysm that devoured thousands of souls. He recalled the moment the craft soared through that shimmering water corridor, the expressions on the priests' faces, and recognized that they had sacrificed themselves for him to go free, or had chosen to vanish into some dimension unknown. He suspected that maybe they believed their knowledge might persist in him, a final witness to their wonders. He spent lonely hours on the ship's deck, gazing at the Atlantic horizon, feeling the ocean's hush and recalling the subtle hum from the city's orb. Now that hush took on a heartbreak. The world resumed its routine, oceanic surveys, data collection, mundane tasks. But for him, each wave flickered with the memory of ancient spires drowned in unstoppable waves. At times, he thought he sensed vestiges of that crystalline aura in the reflections near reefs or in the periphery of his vision, as though a splinter of Atlantis' power had bled into the ocean at large. The illusions might have been a side effect of trauma, or perhaps a sign that the city's essence still lingered in fractured corners of reality. He recognized how ephemeral human civilizations truly are. The concept of time travel took on a fresh darkness. To see a grand realm on the brink of destruction was to realize that no empire, no matter how advanced, is immune to nature's unstoppable forces or to cosmic destiny. More unsettling was the recollection that Atlantean society soared on the merging of ancient crystals with technology beyond modern understanding. They nearly tamed the tides, but in the end, the sea devoured them. The diver, overshadowed by silent anguish, questioned whether the future he returned to might likewise await a submersion of its own, a slow, unstoppable tide of climate havoc or cosmic shift. The parallels haunted him. For a short while, he probed the possibility that the portal might remain open in that reef. He considered diving again, perhaps discovering the same luminous gap. Yet every subsequent submersion found no anomaly. The stone outcropping looked normal, the corridor of rock unimpressive, and no shimmering hue. The door had closed behind him, or so it seemed. He dared not forcibly repeat the circumstances that triggered it. He half suspected that a day might come when it reopened to drag another unsuspecting soul to share in the city's final cataclysm. With no dialogue, no formal confessions, he withdrew from the expedition at its conclusion, carrying scars both physical and emotional. On returning to land, he found it impossible to slip back into everyday patterns. The cityscapes, highways, advertisements, and trivial interactions all rang hollow. He wandered beaches at dusk, scanning the waterline for signs of hidden realms. The mania crept in, longing to see a faint reflection of Atlantean spires shining under the moon. In the hush of the surf, he'd fancy hearing the distant moan of collapsing domes, the calls of a civilization that had vanished under unstoppable waters. He eventually recorded some impressions in a personal journal, illusions of advanced crystal rods, the solemn eyes of Atlantean guardians, swirling waters flooding marble squares. He wrote about the tapestry of a place neither purely ancient nor purely futuristic, but a heady mixture of energies that had soared high before crumbling. He concluded that the Atlanteans, in their apex, overshadowed any known empire. They harnessed the Earth's magnetic fields, spun them with esoteric crystal structures, and nearly transcended physical constraints. But a cosmic alignment or internal flaw triggered their downfall. He, the diver, had been a cosmic footnote in their final chapter. Time blurred his recollections, dulling the raw anguish, yet the memory refused to fade. Rumors from other divers about strange luminous phenomena in remote sections of the Atlantic pricked his ears. He clung to a glimmer of hope that he might glean new glimpses or confirm the experience. But reason told him it was a miracle to have emerged unscathed once. Chasing it further invited a doom. So he lived a quiet half-life, nursing an unspoken secret that Atlantis was real, that it had thrived in crystals and illusions, and that it still existed in some hidden dimension until the moment of its watery grave. The fleeting romance with that kingdom, though not in a conventional sense, shaped him into a husk of restlessness. Late at night, in the hush of an apartment near the sea, he'd sense a faint pull. The memory of the official's determined stare, the priest's stoic acceptance, the subaquatic journey in that crystal craft. He wondered if, in some parallel timeline, Atlantis might have survived, or if the inhabitants found a new era by traveling through the rift. The unknown dwarfed all. He felt a sorrow that no museum or historical compendium could rectify. The lost knowledge and improbable synergy of ancient artistry with futuristic science had crumbled in moments. The sense of unstoppable doom lingers in his soul, a testament to the ephemeral nature of all wonders. At times, standing by the shoreline, he kneels to let the tide lap at his feet. The repeated whisper of water resonates with the final hush of Atlantean corridors flooding. He pictures the orb in the dais, flickering with the meltdown, and how the swirling water overcame it. That orb might still lie somewhere on the Atlantic seabed, battered by currents, overshadowed by centuries of silt and salt, or cast into a dimension no living person can revisit. Thus ended the ephemeral crossing. The tides of Atlantis devoured themselves, leaving him as the lone witness to a realm that defied reason or historical record. No dialogues remain, no triumphant disclosure to scientists, only the overshadowing truth that time can fold in on itself beneath the waves, revealing glimpses of a kingdom suspended between glories and cataclysms. The ocean, ever stoic, continues swirling in indifferent majesty, swallowing civilizations, illusions, and revelations alike. The diver, in quiet nights, closes his eyes and sees spires shining behind his lids, a city that soared on crystal energies and drowned in cosmic inevitability. He draws a ragged breath, reminding himself that not all knowledge brings solace, and that some tides, once unleashed, vanish without leaving an anchor to moor the heart. The aftermath of his return was complicated. Officials from the research expedition, after hearing half-formed references to an undersea city, assumed the diver had experienced a decompression-related delirium or a severe hallucination. They ordered medical evaluations, discovering an unusual spike in his brainwave patterns, but no substantial evidence of sickness. Ultimately, the psychological findings said he might be coping with the trauma of losing consciousness underwater. They recommended rest and counseling, ignoring the cosmic scale of his claims. He complied outwardly, longing for quiet, while internally grappling with the unshakable memory. He decided to leave the oceanographic community for a while, traveling inland in hopes of severing his nightmares from any vantage of the sea. In a mountainous retreat, he attempted to distract himself with forest trails, quiet reading, and nights in which the roar of the waves was replaced by wind through pines. But each dream inevitably circled back to Atlantean corridors, water bursting through fracture lines, or that final hush as he parted from the official's mournful gaze. No matter how far from the coast he wandered, an invisible tether bound him to that watery realm. Some months passed. On a whim, he visited a library in a provincial town. He pored over occult tomes and ancient genealogies referencing Atlantis. Typically, such books teemed with pseudo-historical claims. Still, he recognized certain patterns reminiscent of what he had personally witnessed. Descriptions of crystal spires, canal-based cities, an advanced synergy of technology and magic. He gleaned references to the Great Collapse, a tsunami that spanned continents. One text even mentioned an attempt by Atlantean priests to dispatch messengers to other epochs. He closed the book with trembling hands, aware that he might well have been that messenger. He further discovered legends of Atlantean shards, rumored to appear on beaches after violent storms, shining with unnatural brilliance. Their alleged properties included faint illusions or distortions of time for those who touched them. The diver recalled how the official staff had sparkled with embedded crystals, perhaps linked to that power. He realized that if such shards turned up in the modern world, the resulting chaos might be beyond comprehension. A small crystal from that technology could warp local physics or unleash unstoppable cataclysms. That recognition deepened his burden. He knew that, as of now, none had publicly surfaced. Or if they had, they were locked away. In a remote hostel, he reread his notes scribbled in the aftermath of his return. The lines detailed ephemeral architecture, the tang of Atlantean breezes, the emotions in those final frantic moments. He had written no dialogue. He used only descriptive paragraphs, reflecting the intense sensorium of a city about to drown. He realized, with a pang, that no matter how meticulously he recounted the experience, it lacked the tangibility to convince anyone. So, he stored the notes away, safeguarding them as testament to a truth the world likely wasn't prepared to face. One evening, alone in that hostel, he was awakened by a faint tremor. The building quivered. For a moment, he believed he had been jerked back to Atlantis, but realized it was a mild local earthquake, possibly an ordinary tectonic slip. Yet that flicker triggered a memory, the city trembling as the waters advanced. He felt an urge to rush outside, half expecting to see Atlantean spires. But the quiet mountain scenery offered no illusions, only the hush of night and the faint squeak of shifting timbers. He sank to the floor, heart pounding at the idea that any quake might dredge up fragments of Atlantean relics. The horror of reliving that final meltdown took hold. As time progressed, the diver drifted into a reclusive life, working odd jobs far from oceanic pursuits. Meanwhile, the modern world carried on with its bustle, scientific breakthroughs, climate debates, expansions of commerce. On rare occasions, he glimpsed televised specials about Atlantis, myth or reality. He watched with an inner pang, hearing so-called experts dismissing the legend as improbable. He quietly recognized that the city had indeed existed, not as a simple rumor, but as a vivid reality that transcended the boundaries of time. The smug certainty of the experts gnawed at his mind, but he lacked the resolve or the evidence to set them straight. A year or more slipped away. One morning, he received an unexpected letter with no return address. Inside, a single photograph showed a chunk of translucent crystal set on a beach. Annotations scrawled in pen said, "Fragment from southwestern Atlantic coast. Radiates minor luminescence. Please advise." The handwriting was unfamiliar. Possibly someone had recognized his name from logs of the expedition or had stumbled on a rumor that he believed in Atlantis. The letter asked no direct question, yet it reawakened his dread. If genuine Atlantean crystal had washed ashore, it could inadvertently open cosmic floods or warp local time. The memory of swirling water corridors and submerging spires flared in his mind. He traveled to that southwestern Atlantic region, driven by a sense of responsibility. If a chunk of Atlantean crystal truly lay there, he had to ensure it wouldn't unleash catastrophe or land in unscrupulous hands. On arrival, he found a storm-lashed coast, battered by heavy waves. He scoured the beach, scanning for signs of unnatural shine. The day turned bleak as violent gusts swept a salty mist over the sand. Step after step, he found nothing but driftwood and seaweed. Near dusk, as the tide receded, he spotted a reflective shard lodged in a cluster of basalt rocks. It glimmered faintly in the dying light. Carefully, he pried it loose, cautious not to provoke any resonant meltdown. He held the shard up. It was about half the size of his palm, smooth as polished glass, tinted an aqua hue reminiscent of Atlantean surfaces. A subtle warmth radiated from it, as if it pulsed with unearthly life. For an agonizing second, he feared it might whisk him away into some fresh nightmare. But it lay inert in his palm, quietly glowing. The swirl of memory overcame him. Images of the official and priests encircling the dais orb, the swirling meltdown of the city. Now, a piece of that lost realm lay in his hand, a token of a civilization drowned by the unstoppable ocean. He realized that if he left this shard drifting about, it might eventually spark illusions or open doorways. He recalled the meltdown that devoured Atlantis, hypothesizing that large accumulations of these crystals were essential for the city's advanced function. Perhaps a single shard lacked enough power to do more than faint illusions or mild time distortions. Still, the risk was too high. In silence, with methodical resolve, he hammered it with a rock. The shard resisted with surprising resilience, but eventually hairline cracks formed. A final blow shattered it into tiny shards that glimmered on the basalt like crushed ice. Then, with sorrowful acceptance, he scattered the fragments into the pounding surf, confident that sea currents would dissolve them further or bury them in silt. Another relic of Atlantis destroyed to protect the modern world from unknown perils. He departed the beach in a subdued haze. The sense of carrying out an unspoken duty overcame him. Now he knew that traces of Atlantis might appear unpredictably on coasts. The city's meltdown had not simply vanished from existence. Swirling eddies in the ocean floor could release remnants drifting across time. He felt an unbidden mission to track rumors of luminous coral or foreign crystals, destroying them to keep Atlantean technology from corroding modern reality. Quietly, he accepted this role, embracing a solitary vigilance. He told no one, for none would understand. Thus, he roamed the globe in hush, investigating cryptic sightings, a luminescent artifact found by fishermen in the Azores, a rumored crystal shard in the Caribbean, odd electromagnetic anomalies near certain seamounts. The pattern suggested pieces of Atlantis had scattered more widely than expected, either lodged in the mid-Atlantic ridge or carried along oceanic currents. On each lead, he traveled alone, meticulously collecting or destroying each shard he discovered. The haunting recollection of that advanced yet doomed realm fueled his commitment. He recognized parallels to how the Atlanteans had harnessed cosmic energies beyond their reach, culminating in destruction. The modern era, if these shards fell into reckless hands, might replicate that hubris, perhaps forging unstoppable superweapons or opening rifts that devoured entire coastlines. So he acted in secrecy, with a moral clarity that overshadowed personal risk. The time he spent diving or traveling on battered ferries consumed his life, yet he derived an odd sense of purpose from the silent vow he had made to the official who let him survive the city's end. Years turned to a slow blur. A rumor surfaced about a formidable black market group dealing in Atlantean crystals, rumored to fetch fortunes from clandestine labs or fanatic cults. The diver, living under minimal resources, pursued the faintest leads to intercept these crystals or sabotage deals. He occasionally confronted unscrupulous collectors, staging break-ins at their private vaults to smash shards. No dialogues or dramatic confessions took place, only furtive infiltration and the echo of crystals fracturing under a crowbar. He became a ghost figure, half legend, rarely glimpsed by the underworld that tried to decode his motive. A single man, parted from normal existence, waging a lonely war to keep the memory of Atlantis buried and to preserve the present timeline from corruption. The strain on his mental well-being was fierce. Each time he glimpsed the faint glow of a shard, the swirl of that meltdown re-emerged in his nightmares. The final quake, the watery avalanche. At times, he half believed he glimpsed the official's face in reflections, as though the Atlantean reached from beyond the watery grave to remind him of his duty. The notion that a dead civilization's spirit lingered weighed on him, fueling him to press on. With no place to call home, he drifted from port to port, renting cheap rooms, writing coded notes in battered diaries. He had dedicated his life to a mission no living soul had assigned, all because he alone had survived that cataclysm. On a late journey to a rumored stash in the Cape Verde archipelago, he discovered only a worthless chunk of luminous coral that held no Atlantean essence. He realized, then, that the sightings had dwindled. Possibly, after so many years, the ocean had scattered the last fragments or worn them to inert dust. Or perhaps they lay inert in some oceanic trench, far from humans. The diver felt a mixture of relief and emptiness. The purpose that had sustained him threatened to vanish. He recognized that he might be free to attempt a normal life. Yet the memory of that city's downfall had turned him into an exiled sentinel with no cause left to guard. He traveled back to the same reef near which his first accidental journey took place, intending a final symbolic closure. On reaching that remote spot, he dived once more, the illusions of the past swirling in his mind. The reef looked unremarkable, except for a subtle emptiness where once he had discovered the portal. No shimmer, no vantage of a hidden gap. He pressed his hand to the outcropping, remembering how easily he had slipped into a world both wondrous and tragic. Now, it was silent and inert. The Atlantic, immense and unchanging, bore no sign of supernatural phenomena. As he hovered in the water, a calm acceptance washed over him. The cycle had ended. Surfacing, he let the ocean's hush fill his hearing. No dialogues, no crowds, only the hush of wind and the quiet pulse of the sea. His heart carried the knowledge that Atlantis had existed, that it had soared beyond conventional lines, and that it had died in unstoppable tides. No matter how ephemeral the memory, it shaped his view of humanity's destiny. He returned to the vessel's deck, feeling for the first time a slight lifting of the weight in his chest, as if the vow had been fulfilled. The city's shards were, to the best of his knowledge, neutralized or lost. The meltdown would remain a secret anecdote in a universe that seldom acknowledges legends as reality. He set foot on land once again, with no intention of continuing the lonely quest. He had done enough. The present was secure from Atlantean infiltration, or so he believed. If ever new fragments surfaced, he prayed that others would remain ignorant of their potential or treat them as mere curiosities. The diver, though, would always sense an unspoken bond with that drowned realm. Some nights, he stood on a quiet beach, gazing at the moonlit ocean, feeling a faint ghost of that melodic hum in the crash of waves. The memory looped, the official's stoic acceptance, the priest's calm resignation, the orbs and corridors destroyed in the swirling water. Atlantean pride turned to silent ruins, hidden in some cosmic fold or lying in an undiscovered trench, forever beyond the mortal realm. Thus concluded his involvement with Atlantis. Without romance or triumphant fanfare, only the heavy truth that civilizations can blossom to heights unimaginable, only to vanish in a cataclysm outside the scope of daily reality. No dialogues were etched, no episodes recounted in tabloids. The experience sank into unvoiced memory, an inward testament to the extremes of life beyond the known. Ultimately, the ocean, with its unrelenting hush, took ownership of Atlantis's ghost, while the diver, left to wander in the ordinary world, bore the silent knowledge that time and reality can bend under the pressure of secret wonders, and that sometimes, preserving the stability of the present requires burying that knowledge in the deepest folds of memory.